All right, everyone. So today we're going to start on the wings. This will probably be two different sections. Kind of the basics of the wings in the first one, and then the second video will probably be like specializations across the different insect orders. So I drew out most of this, and I do have a final picture, but the final picture can be really confusing if you aren't familiar with how the wings are set up. So this is just a basic anterior wing, anterior being the front set of wings. Most insects have two sets of wings, the anterior wings and the posterior wings. The anterior wings originate on the mesonotum, and the posterior wings originate on the metanotum, so the second and third sections of the thorax. How this is set up is this is the base, so this is the base of the wing. This is where it attaches to the thorax, and there's a series of plates that will attach it to the thorax. This is the apex. This would be called the posterior margin, and this is called the costal margin. Or you could call it anterior, but it's usually called the costal margin in Keys. Because of the veins. The first vein is called the costa, but we'll get to that in a minute. The wing is divided into generally two sections along a fold here. And it is attached to the thorax with a series of plates here. So if we look at the plates, these in the green here, just quick doodles, the shapes of these plates are different for every insect. And which plates are present are different for every insect. So the three kind of major plates are the tegula, the humeral plate. Let me make sure I can spell this right, and the medial plate. And then these four plates here are called the axial plates. And they're just named axial plate 1, 2, 3, and 4. So easy enough for the plates there. For these axial plates, sometimes, so I say plates, they're sclerites, just to be clear. And sometimes they're called the axillary plates. Some of this will depend on what sources you're using. And just to be clear with the wings have a lot of different names for a lot of the same structures. And this is extremely true when we get to the venation of the wings. You have to remember when talking about any group of insects, one, there's a lot of different species, so things can be a little bit different, and because of each of those species has to be described by someone, so sometimes the wording is different. But also, when you're talking about the major groups of insects, you're talking about work that's been done by thousands of entomologists across hundreds of years. So the terminology for a lot of the different morphological features can vary depending on who wrote the papers or the books on those species and what terminology they were using at the time. And then even between groups, so like the beetles might use different terminology than the wasps, because the people working on beetles are not generally the same group of people working on the wasps. So this will become more important. So don't stress too much about understanding how all of the insects are named, how all of the insects get each of their morphological features named. This will just be covering the general structure. If you are interested in a specific group of insects, focus on the naming systems within that group of insects, and it'll save you a lot of confusion. So, like I said before, we have these axial plates on the base, or axillary sclerites on the base, and the wing is divided into two sections along a fold here. If we go to the folds, the wing actually has a number of folds, and these folds allow the wing to bend while in flight. This fold that divides the wing into two sections is called the claval fold. And that is because the the anterior section of the wing is called the remigium. Let's see if I can spell that right. And the back side, or the posterior half of the forewing, is called the clavus. clavus. We also have a median fold here. And then you have an anal fold and a jugal fold. This section here is called the anal region of the wing, or anal area, and this section back here is called the jugal area. Not all insects have a jugal fold or this jugal area, and not all insects have this anal area. Generally speaking, very generally speaking, the more primitive an insect group, in this case, the earlier it evolved compared to the other insects, the more likely it has all of these structures. The more later evolving, the more advanced species and groups like the wasps and the flies generally have highly reduced wings. They have fewer structures. Generally, they have fewer veins. And that's just a simplification over the course of evolution in the insects for efficiency's sake, basically. If you look at really primitive insects like the Odonata, which are the dragonflies, they have tons of veins, tons of folds, very, very complex wing structures. And then you get to very, very highly advanced insects like the parasitic wasps. They have very delicate wings, very, very few veins, very, very few extra folds and areas and things like that. And that's just a general trend. But these are the major folds that allow flexion during flight. Now we get to the more confusing part, which are the veins. So there are a set of major veins. So there's 6 major veins, possibly a 7th, depending on what group of insects you're talking about. And they're not always present. Like I said, with like the parasitic wasps, they have very, very few veins. They usually just have one or two. But the naming structure from anterior to posterior is generally maintained. So some insects have something here called a precostal vein. It is not always there, and basically there's a small vein with a cell in between the precostal and the major anterior vein of insects, which is called the costal vein. The costal vein is what gives the structure and stabilization to the anterior margin of the wing. I should also point out, since we're talking about this, that these major veins are generally much thicker than all the other like cross veins and things like that on the wing, and these veins contain blood vessels, or in this case hemolymph vessels, nerves, and trachea. So it allows oxygen to get in. So there's blood flow, there's nerve electrical impulse, and there's oxygen getting in. When an insect, maybe you've seen like a butterfly emerges from its pupa or its cocoon, and its wings are really crumpled, and then over the course of a couple hours, the wings unfurl and stabilize themselves. It is because blood, or in this case hemolymph, is being forced into the wing veins, pumped into the wing veins, in order to stretch the wings out while they sclerotize and harden. They're not drying out, they're sclerotizing and hardening, and blood is being forced into them to get them to straighten out before they harden permanently. So this top vein, assuming that there's no precostal vein, is called the costal vein. The next one is called the subcostal vein, or the subcosta. So you have the precosta, costa, and the subcosta. The subcosta is frequently shortened in many insects. So instead of curving up here, it might curve into the costa down here. It's not uncommon. All of these veins have variable lengths, but it goes costa, subcosta, radial vein, medial vein, cubital vein, anal vein, and jugal vein. Again, if the insect doesn't have this sort of anal lobe or jugal lobe, it generally won't have anal veins or jugal veins. Sometimes you'll have an anal vein end up here, and there really won't be much of a lobe, but if they don't have these sections, generally those veins won't be present. Other things to know about the veins. Let me change color here so you can see what's going on. I'll do this in orange so you can see that it's a modification. Veins frequently split. So what you'll see is like a radial vein that goes like this. They'll have lots of cells. Maybe you'll have a medial vein split here, a cubital vein split here. Veins are named, because you might be thinking, well, how do I know which one's the radial vein, the medial vein, things like that, when there's all these splits and folds in them? Maybe there's even an internal fold there, not an internal fold, an internal split there. Really make it confusing. Veins are named from the base out, because the bases will always remain the same. So you will have the costal vein, the subcostal vein, the radial vein, the medial vein, the cubital vein, the anal vein, and the jugal vein at the base of the veins. So don't try to necessarily start naming from the apex end, because it just gets very, very confusing. When veins split, they are labeled 1 through 5 generally at the points on the apex. So in this case, this would be radial 1, radial 2, radial 3, and radial 4. Veins are, in keys and diagrams, veins are usually just labeled with the first letter of their name. So it would be the costa, the subcosta, the radius. You would have medial 1, medial 2, medial 3. Cubital is abbreviated as CU. So this would be CU1 and CU2. Anal is A, and jugal is J. And that's how the vein naming system works, generally. Veins can also be fused, which gets very, very confusing in the naming structure. So frequently the radial and medial veins are fused, and the anal and cubital veins are fused, in which case they would be abbreviated CUA and R plus M frequently. These sorts of naming conventions are group specific. So why some veins are labeled the way they are, you would have to look into the conventions of the group of insects that you're looking at. This is not universal. There are different systems depending on the different groups. So just be aware if you see a diagram where it says, R plus M1, R plus M2, you're talking about the radial and medial veins being fused and then split. But don't think that this applies to all groups at all times. It'll be very, very specific to the group. Wings, if we go back to the blank wing, wings also, anterior and posterior wings, generally have some sort of mechanism to keep them beating in unison and increase how aerodynamic the insect is, decrease the amount of calories that get burned as the insect is flying, because insects don't have tons of body fat, so they need to be very, very efficient with their flight. So what frequently happens is that the wings are bound together by some mechanism. One of the more common ones is for the hind wing back here to have hooks on the anterior margin that hook to the back or the posterior margin of the forewing. These are called hamuli. So these hooks would be called hamuli. Sorry about that. Hooks equals hamuli. The other way that this might be happening, let's change color, is the jugal lobe, so this is the jugal lobe, will overlap with the hind wing. And so as the forewing beats, the hind wing is pushed with it. So that's one way of doing it. And then if you're a butterfly, the forewing and hind wing are linked together with a bristle and hook system called the frenulum and the retinaculum. So there'll be a long bristle that attaches between the forewing and the hind wing and the forewing will latch onto it. And that's why when you see a butterfly, they always have their wings kind of together on them. So if we look at the final picture of what a forewing would look like, now you can understand some of these things that you're seeing here. So you have the apex margin up here, costal margin here, and the posterior margin on the bottom. If we zoom in a little bit, you'll be able to see some more structures here. Let's zoom in. So one thing I didn't mention is sometimes there's a dark spot on the wings. This is called the pterostigma. It is not always present. Certain groups have it more than others. So like parasitic wasps frequently have it, dragonflies frequently have it. But other things, other groups you won't really see it on. So like beetles, you won't see something like that on. This is what I was talking about with the splits. So you have, cubital posterior plus anal anterior 1 plus 2. And so that's a fusion of the veins. And then you have the anal anterior 3, anal anterior 4, anal posterior 1, 2, 3, 4. And all of these splits get named at the posterior margin. Same with up here at the apex margin. You have the subcostal 1, subcostal 2, radial 1, radial 2. These are split and fused veins. So that's what these, all this naming system here, this nomenclature system is pointing to. So when you see this for your particular insect, it can help you decipher it some. So you have median anterior 1, median anterior 2, median anterior 3, so on and so forth. So in this particular group, it's divided by anterior and posterior wing veins. That isn't always the case with the insect. So the more complex the venation of a wing, the more complex the naming structure has to be. So with that, next time we will talk about the actual evolutionary specializations of the wings. So wings of beetles, wings of grasshoppers, wings of stink bugs, and how they differ from each other. But this is the basic intro, and with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks.